Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kai Haley. I'm the lead of design relations and one of the creators of this series. And I'm very excited to have you all here today for a really fantastic speaker. As many of you know, the Design Is series was started about a year ago to create a space to have a dialogue about the role of design in impacting and crafting the future. Specifically with a look at, ethical design and the ways in which we're really creating the future that we all want to be a part of. So that's the focus here. And today we have Danielle Krettek. She's really a true creative force. She has a background spanning design, technology, film, art, architecture, and even social impact. She founded Google's Empathy Lab about 2 years ago as an interdisciplinary approach to design, looking at how we can make design more emotionally attuned and create humankind experiences. She believes the future is feeling and is on a mission to bring deep humanity to AI. And she's been doing that by working with various teams across Google Design, Research, Machine Intelligence, and other projects. So we're very lucky to have her here today, and I'm very excited to have Danielle for Design is Empathic.
Thank you, Kai. So she described a little bit about, and by the way, because the Empathy Lab has been sort of stealth until quite recently, don't worry if you haven't heard of it. A lot of people even at Google haven't. But yeah, basically this group started, and I'll tell the story in a little bit, but this group started, and I feel like what's interesting is, you guys might feel this too, that something you're working on starts to, you feel it kind of in your heart, in your bones, you start working on something, and then it starts to gain momentum, and then it kind of finds its time. And so what's lovely about being able to share this work with you today is just that it feels like it's finally starting to find its time. So the reality of really needing an interdisciplinary team kind of working in the AI space is so critical right now. Really what it means to blend the social sciences with the creative arts, to be doing research, doing design, making films all at the same time. I sort of joke that my seat at the table amongst really talented engineers and scientists is to speak human. And I know that this room kind of knows what I mean by that, but it's this kind of funny thing when you're the voice of beauty or emotion or just what it means to be a messy human at the table. I feel like tech moves really, really fast, but we don't. So where I try to draw a lot of inspiration, some of the ride I'll take you on tonight, is from the things that really never change in humans. I look as equally kind of to Jane Goodall as like James Turrell and, as I do to like Elon Musk for what's kind of going on. So kind of with that, I will get into it, which, every good thing starts with a Frank Zappa quote. So what I love about this quote, without deviations from the norm, progress is not possible, is it signals like we are at a threshold where something is different. It's almost this like kind of silly little logical flaw to think that like technology just progresses and different things happen. It's like there are kind of these chunks of time in which everything kind of turns over. And I'm sure you all know, and you feel it and you see it in the work that you're doing. It's like we're at that moment right now. And it feels like Empathy Lab was kind of this happy accident, like I mentioned, where a few things started to come together and it felt like something else was rising up. So what happened, and when I present this slide at Google, this is my slide where I'm like, everything I say after this is bulletproof. You can trust everything because there was so much research. But basically what happened was there was a series of studies over the course of a year and a half. I looked into notifications and voice and personas and meaningful objects and chatbots and all these things. The Struggle is Real was a study about emotions. But basically, gathered over 10,000 data points and talked to people in almost every single state. And what I found was, for any of you guys that are researchers in the room, there's the thing that you set out to study, the thing you need to find, and the kind of specific thing you have to bring back to the product team. And then there's everything else you learn along the way. It feels kind of like Scheherazade and Arabian Nights. It's like what's the story I'm going to tell tonight? And what I found was that across all of these studies, the same things kept showing up. And after a certain point, I said, okay, I really want to listen to that. I want to figure out what that is. I want to tell that story. So that really was kind of the origin of the lab. And it's also what I'm going to share with you right now. And the best place to root it is really kind of what it means to have been in the paradigm of UX for the last 10 years specifically. We can kind of look at it from its inception. But the last 10 years were kind of the most significant, because when we think about this paradigm, I was actually working at Apple 10 years ago with everybody on the launch of the iPhone. We had no idea at this point all of the unintended consequences and all of the beautiful things that would come from smartphones, multi-touch, the appverse. Things are very, very different now. And one of the numbers that really kind of like, it stung a little, and it also was kind of just amazing that I kept seeing show up in the media, was this thing a couple years ago where I heard like people were opening their phones 150 times a day, and people were like gasping and like, whoa, that's a lot. But what they didn't publish was what people are doing and for how long and how they felt about that and how that kind of fit in their day. And so I ended up, of course, getting curious about that and doing my own research. And so in doing that, I basically had people let me track everything that they did on their phones, every tap, swipe, touch, text entry for an entire week. And what I found was that across, kind of everyone, what we saw was that for a super light user, they opened their phone, and did something 72 times a day, which was like 2,600 touches. For heavier users, probably like us, it's more like 10,000 times a day. And what that adds up to over the course of a year is actually like 1 to 2 million touches, depending on how heavy your use is. And kind of what's fascinating about that is, well, actually, there was this woman in the study, and what was so great, the reason that this, the San Francisco to Big Sur note is there, is she was like, I wonder how many miles I've scrolled with my thumb. And I was like, you are totally doing my job for me. That is a great question. I need to answer that. And so basically, within the course of a year, someone like us, a heavier user, literally goes from San Francisco to Big Sur 2 inches at a time on their phone. So like, yay for the hippie beatnik thumbs. But unfortunately, that's not exactly like the line of drive for this density of interaction. But I think it's really easy to kind of Sherry Turkle style freak out about the density of an interaction. I think an area that people haven't looked at that is really interesting is the sensitivity of the interaction. So when we look at that density across a day, morning, noon, and night, people, first thing they wake up, use it all day, last thing they do at night. People get up in the middle of the night, they actually check then. There are kids I was talking to who sleep with them underneath their phones. You guys know all of this stuff. This is kind of where we are right now. But I think what's interesting about that is, okay, well, so that's the density. The sensitivity then is, are you alone? Are you with people? Are you with people you know really well, people that you love, your partner? Are you with friends? Are you with a ton of people? Are you busy? Are you tired? Are you stressed? Are you happy? What are all of these things? All of a sudden, we look at the on-off switch, which is like a total joke anyway, because it's always on. And then you also look at like, well, how else do we kind of show up and modulate all those spaces? People have all of these emotions, all of this spectrum, all of this emotional travel. How are we showing up for that? Do not disturb is like radically insufficient and kind of ridiculous when you look at that. Like, there's no way of saying, well, I'm in this place, I'm in that place, I want to filter in this way, I need this thing, I want to go to do that thing, and I want to be in this place kind of emotionally. So I think what's interesting about that then, of course, is I'm going to take it to research, and I wanted to know more about, okay, well, what if we look at this as not just the information flow? So I was actually working on what is now Google Pixel Buds now, but we called it Apollo back then was its code name. And what happened with that study was, it was like, what's the flow of information that you want? Super basic question. Notifications are like super unsexy. And what I wanted to do to add to that, to make it creative and interesting and something that people could kind of get to a juicy, authentic place with in terms of giving me stuff that was going to be inspiring for our designers, was I was like, okay, we're going to ask all the basic questions about the anatomy of these things and how they work and blah, blah, blah. But what I also want you to do is think about airplane mode. And airplane mode is one way, but give me 10 more for all the modes that you're in during your day. Just tell me what that's like. Show me what you do. And what was amazing was that people came up with like 500 different modes across all of them. And thankfully, with pattern recognition, it's really 4: focus, filter, normal, and amplify. Amplify was a surprise. People were like in the mood to absorb kind of 40% of the time, which was amazing. But what you saw is people were like, okay, I'm in like beast mode or like profesh mode or like gentle morning, like shh mode, which correlated highly with hungover mode. There was also like Jesus is my homeboy mode because, we talked to everyone. And what was beautiful about that was that this wasn't about modes at all. It's about moods and the spaces that people are in. And when you start to think with that as your design lens, it's just like 4 clicks over from where you were before. But when we think about modes, we're coming kind of tech first. When we're thinking about moods, we're coming from this watery space. It feels a lot messier to design into, but has so much more resonance kind of at the heart of it. So what was also interesting, because I was designing this experience as an audio first experience, it was like, okay, well, if basically you're only going to be listening to these things, if it's whispering in your ear, I went back to the same people and said, okay, now I want you to tell me for the stuff that you wanted to kind of make it in, the people you wanted to make it in, the things you wanted to know, the things you didn't, when you were in those different modes, kind of speak it to me, basically. Like, just take me through that. Do you want it to be informal or not informal? Do you want it to speak long form? Like, how does it work in this space? Because cognitively, it's just such a different kind of load. And what was amazing was that, like, literally every single person that did the study came back and they had these, like, SNL skits where it was like they had characters and accents and they brought roommates and friends in, they shot in cars, like it was super like dramatic, theatrical, to the point where I literally, the first time I presented this, I didn't share the story, but every time since I have, I literally thought I messed up the research. I was like, I've clearly biased it in some way. I have no idea what word I put in there, but something happened. So I did it again, and the exact same thing happened. So that's when I called some of my scientific advisors, like Dacher Keltner at Berkeley, and said, can you help me understand what's going on here? Because like something is going on here. And what was cool is he, of course, was like, basically, language is the marker of our species. It's literally the thing that distinguishes us, and we are wired for connection. So when you think about what shows up when language shows up, is really, unless it's a fairy tale, you aren't speaking and listening to something else. So it triggers this deep neurobiological place in us that's about connection. So what shows up is a lot more emotion, a lot more expression. It's literally 150,000 years of human hardwiring that just takes us to a different place, kind of whether we like it or not. It's why when you see people talking about getting mad at Siri, they're like, no, I know that's crazy. Like, I know it's just a phone. But at the same time, all the emotions present. So I think what's fascinating about that is there's kind of this like dissonance there. And that's kind of what's so powerful really about the brain. And when you think about the anchors and origins of this paradigm, it's such a different space because it's not just, oh, let's work with like a momentum scroll or a gradient or let's round the corners. We're working with deep, deep invisible switches inside of us. So that's where I kind of got to this place where I was like, I need to be able to articulate the difference here. So this paradigm, when we look at the paradigm of UX versus the one that we're shifting into, which like, I'm not like inventing a new discipline or name for this, but it's just to bring the human part forward to say that this is in addition to what we already did, kind of something we have to deeply care for and consider, is that in the paradigm of UX, if you think about human change, there are like 3 legs of that stool. In order to change a belief, an action, a way a person is, any aspect of their lives, you need cognition, behavior, and emotion. All 3 of those things have to be aligned. So kind of when you feel like the whole person is engaged, it's always those three things. And then when we look at UX kind of as a paradigm and the things that rule that paradigm, it's very much about what do you think and what are you doing? And then, really when you look at things like Google or other apps that you're designing to kind of optimize, it's about the reliability, the speed, the accuracy. That's so much of the touch paradigm. But when we move to this space, when we're triggering these other things, when it's an inherently kind of social and emotional interaction, just because like that's the intelligence that shows up for us here, that's much more about inference and kind of trust and dependability and recall. And really what all of that is attunement. So when we talk about voice and assistants and chatbots and really machine learning and what it all bubbles up to in this kind of AI space, it's really, really different because it takes all 3 for people to connect in this space. And all of that's going on. And I think what's interesting is it's almost like VR. Like you either feel it or you don't. You feel it when it works, and you can really feel when it's different. It's like new things kind of matter now that didn't necessarily matter before. And I think what's fascinating about that is it gives us this provocation that you guys kind of already heard, but it's this idea that it's really time for technology's EQ to match its IQ. It's not just about your feature set. It's not just about what you do or how you do it. It's actually about how it feels. And it's so critical to start designing for that that invisible layer, which I sort of jokingly at Google talk about as it's as much about the immaterial design as it is about like our material design. And so to break that down, because it's like, well, that's great, but it sounds a little kind of up here. How do you start to pull that down into specific principles or distinctions so that you can begin to design into it with some, basically with some teeth? And so these are kind of some big distinctions that I'm going to cruise through right now. But the first is moving from the paradigm or just the idea of engagement, which is clicks and daily actives and how long your time spending or how much time you're spending there, to something that's more about a relationship, that's something more connection based and where your metrics are really aligned with that. And so, of course, to get into that, I did like a ridiculous lit review that was like every paper on kind of like friendship, connection, intimacy, like whatever it was. There were some hilarious studies on teenagers in particular, but did this lit review, and I boiled it all down for y'all. So the good news is really all of that just says that, again, there are kind of 4 stages of connection. And this is true. This is kind of the blueprint, basically, for connection. So what you see is there's this first phase of initiating, then you're experimenting, then you're intensifying, then you're integrating. I think 4 is really left to humans. That's not a place for kind of HCI exploration. But what's fascinating is that when you look at this, it starts as a kind of a social connection. And what you see is that the things that people, for instance, say that they want in like a digital assistant, they want it to be warm and open and friendly and clear. Those are the same things that we ask for in a person. When you think about who you walk across the room at a party to talk to, it's someone who has those qualities. So it's this funny thing where the kind of unspoken wires that run inside of us show up here, the things that we do naturally as monkeys, like we just kind of can't help do. So when you're experimenting, you're trying to figure out the things you have in common, which is like people talking about like music or movies or whatever. When you have enough of those points, you feel connected, then you start to not just talk about the things you have in common, but you do those things together, you create new experiences. And what I think is really powerful about the space of 2 and 3, which is like kind of where we want everything to go in the next few years, is that's when it's about nonverbal communication and other forms of connection and kind of all of the nuances, all of the little things like inside jokes and secret language and nicknames and the idea of what does it mean to grow to know someone? What are the signals of that kind of connection? And how do we kind of meaningfully start to play with those in a way that makes sense? So of course, being a Google person, I, to quote The Martian, had to science the shit out of it because otherwise it sounds like I'm kind of getting a little too Oprah, Sally, Jesse, Raphael with all of this stuff. It gets a little touchy-feely and I have to bring my hard science to meet my soft science. So what I did was I looked for relationship scientists or people that had kind of quantified human development and connection. And fortunately, there is a couple called John and Julie Gottman who are up in Washington, and they have published a ton of books, but they also welcomed me into one of their workshops to kind of really get deep into the crunchy parts of it. And how many of you guys have heard of the Gottmans? Oh, awesome. Like love rooms like this. So what's great about the Gottmans, for those of you guys that don't know, is that they basically got kind of famous in the 90s when divorce was hockey sticking, because what happened was they had kind of identified 2 things. The first was they were the people that can sit with you and your partner and within 20 minutes tell you whether you were going to break up in 6 months, 7 years, or after that. So like the worst dinner party guests ever. But at the same time, the other thing that they found, which is relevant here, is that basically people were really concerned with, okay, if you know who's going to make it as a couple, then what are the indicators of that? Is it people that fight all the time and then make up? Is it people that never argue, that are conflict averse and kind of 50s style? What works? Like, please tell us what works. And what they said was actually the style of coupling, the way you argue, the way you connect, none of that matters. What really matters is this ratio of positive to negative experiences, and that you can actually look at all kind of literally from like galvanic skin response. They had this wet lab that was wired up for like everything a partner said and like every side eye that was cast, and at the same time what like was actually going on physiologically. So the science behind this is insane for nerds like myself. But what was beautiful was it got to this place where it was like a healthy relationship has a 5-to-1 ratio. That's the math. And then a really healthy relationship, a really strong one, like what they considered a great marriage, one of their masters, their methodology was called Masters in Disasters, and the masters were 20-to-1. But I think what's interesting about this is I basically was like, okay, well, if this relationship theory or this connection theory or all of this kind of developmental stuff is true, then I should be able to put my metrics where my mouth is. So I actually designed a study that had 3 different assistants that had varying levels of kind of talk. But what they did, so it was like some was talking or voice, some of it was texting. It was kind of using every mode that was available or modality that was available. And so one of them was kind of straight information. So it knew a lot of stuff, but was very kind of straight. The second one was kind of not really much of anything. It did a little bit, didn't have a lot of kind of expression, didn't have a lot of great copywriting, to be frank. The attuned one actually did less than the info-driven one, but it spoke to you in a way, the copy was written in such a way that it was warmer and it had kind of more nuance to it. And what we found that kind of says everything is that basically, you can see the ratios up there. The one that was attuned had the 5-to-1 ratio and felt better. So it literally did less, but it felt so much better to people. And then the thing that really matters is not just the research that you do in that moment, and kind of accounting for bias, et cetera. It was a couple months later when I checked in and said, are you guys still using it? And what you see is like 3 times the loyalty for the attuned one as well. So big indicator of kind of what this really means. What that means, of course, is that you're moving from kind of classic onboarding flows to something that's more about the watery spaces of connection and reading someone and showing up with the information that kind of makes sense to them. So how many of you guys have heard of the 36 questions, or Arthur and Elaine Aron? If any of you guys were dating a few years ago, there was an article in the New York Times that invariably came up in like every single conversation. People were like, do you want to try that? And what it was, for those of you that were spared that, was 3 sets of 12 questions of increasing mutual vulnerability. Because basically the 2 things that determine connection are increasing mutual vulnerability and knowing that a person is not kind of going anywhere, that they're going to be around. So when you think about like sunsetting features, it's like, this is different too. What was fascinating here though is what they saw. So it was these 3 sets of 12 questions, and then it was 4 minutes of uninterrupted eye contact at the end, which is so awkward. But what they found was that people that came into the Love Lab and did this, they actually had like just so many people that would leave and then would find themselves in couples together. They even had marriages that came out of it. And what that showed was basically that there is kind of a blueprint almost for connection and intimacy. And what's interesting about some of the questions that are asked and the way that they're asked and the sequence in which they're asked is they show you a lot about how people can get comfortable in actually a quite predictable way. And this is the point in the presentation where I say, what's really fascinating about this is that there are kind of universal currents within our connection and who we are and how we are, and that it's biologically wired. And what's challenging there, I think, is a space when we start talking about these things is it's important to have so much integrity and so much consideration for this, because the defaults and the things that we don't pay attention to actually can be really manipulative and damaging, almost in a way that's even kind of crazier than the paradigm that we're living in now, which has like attention and stuff like that as a consequence. So this idea of how are we being really mindful, how are we being really careful, and actually how are we using this as a way to advance the understanding of what it means to be transparent and ethical with people, because we can rely kind of on some of these things. And the next thing was, as I was doing this, of course, I'm constantly like checking myself, because if I'm going to go into an exec and talk about this stuff, I want to be able to be like bulletproof. And so I found this other study that was done at Harvard, because my question at that point was, okay, all of this is really fascinating. Is it actually true for a human and a machine? Like at some point, are you like, okay, come on, like I get it, it's a really cool theory, but like, is it real? Does it really matter? Do you really feel it? And what was amazing about this study is it was kind of the aha moment where like epiphanies tend to be both like super obvious and at the same time a little profound. And what happened was there was a woman at Harvard who did a study where she had a person come into a lab with a machine, and the machine boots up and basically says, I'm a computer, and the goal of our session today is for you to tell me a little bit about yourself. So I'll ask you some basic information. And then what I'd love for you to do is tell me what you were most guilty or ashamed of in your life. And so people had two reactions. One was they lied. They were like, I don't have any of that. And the other was they were like, this is totally ridiculous. I'm leaving. One-way vulnerability feels awful to us. Anybody that's had a vulnerability hangover knows that. And then what she did was she programmed it to run a different script the next time. And what happened the next time is it basically, instead of kind of just feeding out more of the monologue with a couple of kind of questions to be answered, instead it said, I'm a computer, there's no one behind the screen, basically like no one's speaking through me, it's just us. And, what I need to tell you before I ask you some questions about yourself is from time to time, I will crash. And often, like in the most inopportune moments for reasons that are totally unknown to you. What's your name? Where are you from? And what's something in your life you're most guilty or ashamed of? And people were like, bah. Just like super catharsis. And what's kind of amazing about that is that there's this thing in us where we can't help but be human. And so vulnerability is vulnerability in whatever way it shows up. And it's so powerful to have that show up. We cannot ignore that call. It literally is like what made our species survive, the ability to kind of do that with each other. So again, super powerful space. So we're moving from what would have been kind of just designing screens to really designing dialogue and what I steal from the field of mammalian biology, which is called physical synchrony. This was a study I did where this was a couple years ago, and I was like, oh my God, I'm so fascinated by chatbots. They feel like imaginary friends. They like show up when you want and disappear when you, this is fascinating. Like, I gotta learn more. And I did this study, and what ended up happening is it quickly became this messy study that was like kind of about chatbots and kind of about what good texting was and bad texting was and people. And so what was funny is this is basically, it was almost like sculptural. This is what the shape of a good conversation is on text. So we all know the Tolstoy texter, which is just like really, really long, or the machine gun texter that's like back and forth and back and forth. This is actually the shape of a good conversation. And I think what's interesting here too is you take out the content, and this is actually what's left, and it was pretty universal for everyone in the conversation. So just this idea that emotion and what is like a good kind of resonant back and forth has a shape is another way of looking at design that's a little bit different. I love this example because I have a friend who started a company called Tia, and it's basically their line for their product is that it's for millennial women. It's meant to be a health expert. It's basically your BFF with an MD, which I love. And it's some brave women that started that company, so I'm a huge supporter of them. But what was rad was Carolyn was telling me that they actually found that 80% of their heavier uses use the heart emoji, and I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. Tell me more. And she basically said that what happens is that they get to a certain point where they're sharing information that's super personal, and that it feels better when they actually are communicating with Tia in the same way that they would with a friend. It feels like it's an easier way to impart information, but also a way to kind of take the edges off some of the weirdness of that. And what they saw is that for those people, again, 3 times the amount of loyalty, just because they could be expressed and heard and seen in that way, which I think is just super powerful. Again, it's what are you bringing as the human into this, and how do you meet someone kind of where they are? The other piece that kind of comes along with like physical synchrony is I brought in this guy, Franz de Waal, who wrote a book called, many books, but he wrote a book called The Age of Empathy. And I think what's interesting is that he talks about how we think of empathy. Brene Brown defines empathy as a moment where you're like, I know the thing you're feeling. I have felt it too. Like, I'm here with you, me too. And it's that deep emotional connection. It's that simple. There's a lot of other definitions, but it's not being nice, and it's not being therapeutic, and it's not having a conversation with your best friend where you're like just going there. Actually, mammalian biology and the origins of it are super subtle, and they're really beautiful. It's like fish that rub up against each other, or when you blush, or when you yawn and someone else yawns. They're all these like super, super small things where it's almost kind of funny. I'll get to this in a minute. We've like jumped to the very end of the spectrum with the kind of assistant space, these like human-ish shaped talking things, when in fact the things that feel like connection to us start so much more subtly and so much earlier. before. And actually, there's so much to be learned from kind of the animal space because of this. But to hit that point again of just like humans gonna human, the whole like what we bring to the equation is like 92% of it. That actually is like not a stat, but speaking conceptually with that. But what's interesting, so I did this study that was basically for Google Home, and I was just so curious, like taking out all of the content of what they were saying, how did they communicate non-verbally with the device? And what you see is that even though it's a voice device, 7% of people still feel the need to be like, did you get that? 86% like eye contact. And what was amazing was that there was this one mom that I love so much. The way she would talk to her children and she'd be like, blah, 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 blah. And then she'd kind of correct herself and stand back here. But she was always a bit like this. And what was funny is when like the device wouldn't respond right away or would have a delay, she'd ask it a question and then she'd be like, in the same way she would look at her kids to be like, did you brush your teeth? And it was just this funny thing where like she couldn't help it. Like it's just the way she was. Also, you know, close to 30% of people are gesturing a lot, even though the machine can't see their gestures. And what was kind of fascinating about that as well was that people that got frustrated gesture so much more. Like everybody gets a little Italian when they're angry. So just being, again, the types of things you can notice, the types of attunement that are available to us in this space, what it means to be designing for those. Again, it's super about moods and not modes. And this was actually that same study. And what was fascinating is you get into this space with assistants and people are like, okay, rad, it's the Jetsons. Like, this thing's gonna be my best friend. It's gonna do all the stuff for me that I hate. They're so excited and curious. They wanna try everything. The family gets in on it. It's like the dog. And then they realize that they hit the wall of this thing because there's like only so much they can do right now. And then they just slide down into the place of like, well, I'm bored. And what's interesting about this space of kind of apathy is it's like all the emotion drains out and they're like, no, okay, I don't really care anymore. And what's funny about that is the way that they actually treat it changes. The articles that they use for it's a she or it's an it, things like that. But I think what's fascinating about this space isn't just that that happens, because we've all seen cliffs like this with kind of products for all time. What I did was a study where I basically had people do the normal stuff that they would do for 3 days. And then on the 4th day, I basically said, try anything. Like stuff that you know isn't gonna work, stuff you aren't sure if it's gonna work, like Magic Genie this thing, like just try everything. And what was fascinating was that its failure rate was actually like way lower than you would have expected. It's not like all the new stuff failed. What ended up happening is they were in this curious kind of playful space with it. And a lot of the things that they tried worked. So there was this element of kind of discovery that showed up along with that curiosity and play. And what was fascinating was just the way that they connected with it, the language that they used, it all changed too. They literally started to go back up towards the curious space. And what I think is fascinating about that is you can have a lot of conversations about how do we write the right things, how do we design the right things, how does this feel human to us? And it's almost like problematic, that word, because it needs to stretch to the space of humanity and machinity to be able to explain some of these weird spaces that are starting to show up now. But what you see is that we kind of have this conversation around what does it mean to project humanity so that people can connect and understand what's going on with all of this stuff in the background. And what I found powerful about this is actually tapping people's humanity, taking them to a place where they were feeling all of those things is so much more powerful than projecting humanity. So what it means to be the thing in the room that knows that it's like time to put on a Stevie Wonder song, or that also knows that you do not play the Smiths in the morning, that is actually an incredibly like resonant place to be in the house, not the all-seeing, all-knowing thing that does whatever you want. So I thought that was kind of lovely. So clearly we're designing presences now, not products. And what that means is there's something kind of like this that's going on. So I'll say this is my personal opinion. I know that there are tons of things being designed all across the space. I think all of the exploration is wonderful, but I am kind of staking out a space that I think we're moving from interface into this space that I kind of call animism, because it's like things are coming alive and aware of their context and whatever. And then you can kind of go past that into like the anthropomorphic space where they're like, you know, looking and being humanish, or like, eyeballs and things come into play and they move in certain ways. And then really, I think that that's part of the path towards humanoid. And literally the definition of humanoid is resembling or being like a human. And I think that's the space that feels like this kind of like false grail, because it feels really hollow and it feels a little bit like a lie. And I love Pixar's kind of integrity around this space where they play with bringing things to life and connecting with people all day, every day. And they talk about truth and materials. How are you true to the materials that you're using to be honest and connect with people through a story? And I think that kind of honesty here requires us to have a level of rigor as designers that is just, I find myself literally getting a headache almost every day as I try to like sort out the pieces and the difference in how they feel. It's just like a totally different level of noticing. But I think off from animism is the space of humanness. And that's the space I've kind of started to talk about today, which is the essence or feeling of what it is to be human, the essence of that connection. You think about like Bauhaus design and what it means to be entirely reduced as something, but to still hold the spirit of it. I think that's what we're looking for in this space. And that's about some of the things I'll talk about in a minute. But really, what this means, I sort of, I have a fantasy where I get to describe myself as like an art teacher for machines. And really what that is if you think about AI or machine learning and you flip it, it's actually about these machines that are all learning how to be with us. They're trying to figure out their jobs and how to do them well. It is this sense of some people are teaching them the science and the math because they need to know those things to do our jobs. I like to think of myself as the one that teaches them like finger painting and kindness and honesty. But really the distinction here as we move from interface, or as the actual computer science technical description of what we're doing, we're moving from commands to feeling like something's listening to you, from interactions to something that's expressive, from functions to feelings, from inferences to conversation, to storing data to remembering things, and what it means kind of to be not just with this inert device, but with something that feels like a companion or co-pilot. So the most important part kind of all of this is you've got a sense of the kind of social science landscape there, but moving beyond that, which I think really that starts to kind of put some architecture together for us to be able to say, well, these are things that are important and here's how we can have that conversation. But if we get kind of to that layer below that I'm describing, that immaterial, invisible, emotional layer, like how do you get there? And I think this is the really exciting part for kind of all of us as designers, is the way that you get there is through these kind of sources of deep humanity. It's the universal languages that are like born inside of us that we all speak and we don't necessarily bring in the room, but sometimes we pin it up on the wall. And really kind of what that is it's like these deep signals of resonance. It's beauty and flow and story and empathy and presence and art and poetry. And so the ones that I'm going to talk about right now are basically, I might get to the art part, but Frank Capra, who's an incredible director, says that film is one of 3 universal languages. The other 2 are math and music. And we know that machines obviously speak math. We hope that they speak music. We know that Doug Eck and the Magenta Gang are working on that. But I'm deeply inspired. I could just ramble about stuff like this all day. So for you that are in the audience that are friends with me, this is true. I'm going to stick to film for the economy and elegance of this chat. But how many of you know this film? Y'all are young. Love it. Okay, well, let me school you. So basically, this is Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is a Spielberg film that's literally 40 years old, which is crazy, or 30 years old, something like that. I'm looking at my film expert in the audience. And the amazing thing about this film is when Spielberg talks about it, he talks about how he was trying to figure out, he knew that this advanced civilization was going to come to Earth, and of course that science and math would have got them here. But if they were going to connect with humans, they needed to speak a different kind of language. So what was beautiful is he talked about reflecting back on going stargazing with his dad, and that it felt like that was both this act of kind of science and imagination at the same time. And as he was thinking about, well, what is the conversation that feels like math but is something else? He said, it's music, which is why the kind of song that they play is the thing that everybody remembers. And it's also why he chose color to communicate. And so some people remember the song, some people remember the light show, some people remember the mound of mashed potatoes. But what Steven Spielberg knew as kind of the best, I think, MI designer on the planet right now is that humans are emotional creatures, and so you have to be able to connect through an emotional language like music. You saw the same thing with Amy Adams in Arrival. What was so beautiful about that is that she's like choppering into the crazy place with all the like, at that point she had just these floating stone-like things. The one guy is like, we need to ask them like, how did they get here and how do they travel and what are all the physics that they don't know that they know and that we don't know. And she was like, whoa, can we just like calm down and start a conversation with them before we start throwing math problems at them. And I think we're in this kind of interesting, similar space right now with AI, where it's really easy to get wrapped up in the deep technical issues and the ethics issues and the media conversation. And the people that really matter the most of this conversation is everyone that doesn't understand how to speak this language, the people that didn't study those things. Like Emmanuel Macron got up about a month ago at his Humanity and AI conference and talked about the policy that France now has for AI. And he was like, if I can't get up here and explain these things in a language that everyone in this country and everyone in the world understands, I don't have a right to stand here anymore as someone creating policy for the way we live. Like, there are many possible futures. You need to understand and be invited into this story so that you can basically understand, participate, and be represented. So I think what's really powerful about these things is how is story and beauty an invitation in for people that wouldn't necessarily be interested otherwise? How do we speak their language? I love bringing this film up because people have such different reactions to it, because obviously for a lot of us, it was like when this came out, it was like, oh, okay, now we have to go make that. And I think what's interesting is, so Jeff McFetridge, who was actually the designer of the interfaces in this film, we worked together, and he was like, what if that was 2017? What if this wasn't the future? It was like the place that we'd already gone to, and we got to learn from what went wrong. And I love that way of looking at this film. And I love what KK Barrett did with this film in terms of designing it. Was neurobiologically, if you look at like Tron and Blade Runner and films that are like black and blue and dark, it's meant to take you to this interesting unknown place where you don't know what's going to happen, because that's what happens at night when things go kind of bump. But in a space where you want to tell a story about the potential kind of beauty of the future, you've got to get all the black and blue out of there. And you have to put a lot of red and pink so people know it's a love story and not a horror story. And I think, again, as we're designers thinking about the things we're creating, it's like, how are we really wrestling with these universal languages of color to get people to a place where they can feel comfortable and familiar and safe? And so the next slide is where the wild things are. And I sort of joke that while people think that Her was Spike Jonze's AI film, I actually think this one was. So it was a film he made right before Her. It's the exact same film as far as I'm concerned, because it's basically about someone who in a moment of imagination goes on an adventure beyond themselves. And so I think, if you guys know these films, or if you know other films, I think the space that we're in as we're designing isn't just about how are we solving this problem in front of us in a way that's effective for the business and for the person and for the thing that needs to be done. It's actually, how can I drop into some emotional space that carries some feeling for me and bring that into what I'm doing because it's relevant, or it makes sense, or it actually underscores in a way that helps all of those things that I just mentioned. I just put this in because it's so lovely. And then the last film I'll talk about is E.T. So how many of you guys have seen E.T.? Yes. And actually, that's really telling. So Close Encounters, not everybody saw. E.T., everybody's seen. And this is literally like, it's one of the top films on iTunes. It's one of the top grossing box office films of all time. It's a globally loved film. And what's so magical about this film, again, this is like, for me, this is an onboarding experience where I'm like, okay, the alien, he's like, Elliot's mom is finally gone. He's been like done this whole ruse Ferris Bueller style in the morning so that he's like, I'm sick. And E.T. comes out of the closet, and it's their first real moment of connection where it's not like, what's this thing in the yard or whatever. And also, like, note to self, if ever designing an alien, make it like this weird, ugly thing that can't run fast, because then it's not scary because he can't chase you. But what's beautiful about this is in this scene, and like at Google, I'll play this and people are like, we're 4 minutes in, like really? But I'll spare you. But what's lovely is it's literally Elliot saying, let me introduce you to my world. Here is the map of me. Get to know me. And it's like, this is a fish, and this is a fishbowl, and this is a peanut, and this is a car, and we drive them. Gives a shout out to George Lucas. He's like, this is Greedo and Lando Calrissian and all the things that matter to me. And when we look at a relationship, it's a series of points built together for texture and topography over time. And when we look at interactions, it's the same. When we look at the kind of promise of machine learning and just this whole space, it's how can those things actually attune to and learn you to a certain point where you feel met and known. And so the simplicity of this scene just crushes it for me. And what's also kind of incredible is this is a film that is deeply about empathy. I mean, literally that is the language, the nonverbal language that E.T. and Elliot share. And you see it begin in the scene because as he starts to know the map of Elliot, at the end of the scene, Elliot's like, are you hungry? I'm hungry. And that's the beginning. That's the beginning of this empathic connection that they then have that takes them to the end. And the other thing you might not know about this film is that when Spielberg was asked what kind of film he was making, he didn't say, I'm making a space film about aliens. He'd already made that one. This film was actually about divorce. And what he talked about with Elliot as a character and their family with this, newly single mother is there's a scene where they're eating dinner and the mom asks a question and Drew Barrymore's character says, oh, Dad's with his new girlfriend or whatever. And you just see Elliot's face and he's just heartbroken. And so he talks about what it means to be a little boy that has lost his dad and what it means to have that kind of broken heart. Like nothing can heal the heart of a little boy who's just lost his dad. The only thing that could possibly heal that broken, tender heart is something that's so extraordinary, so out of this world, that it just takes him to a very, very different place. And I think that's what's kind of amazing about this film, is that it's something from far, far away, a place that we do not understand, that comes and is able to see with different eyes and share that with a little boy so that he can actually see something different as well. And one of the, I'm forgetting his name right now, but one of the actors that talked about what Spielberg did and the reason that everybody loves this film so much globally is that if you can see this little boy and this alien connect in this incredibly powerful way, then you know that like that moment of empathy, there's no two humans on Earth that are any farther apart than that. So it gives us it gives you this sense of kind of implicit hope. So the way I will go from that place back to like where we are as we're designing for the space of AI is that empathy as like, can a machine be empathic or can it have empathy? Like, no, and I think that's kind of a silly conversation. I think it's not the real conversation. It's another kind of false grail that just is like kind of crazy to talk about. I think what's more interesting is this sense of empathy requires an emotional connection. And the beautiful thing about machines is that they learn to do and do things that humans do, but in their own way. And the in their own way part is the part that is actually the enhancement, the augmentation, the promise for us. It's a way that's the thing that kind of starts to unlock more of human potential because of what's possible there. And I think that AlphaGo, so wait, how many people have seen this? The AlphaGo documentary? It's amazing. Like, I'm such a nerd that I cried when I watched it because I was like, this is a beautiful moment. Empathy Lab, right? So what happened that was kind of the watershed moment in this was there was this one move called Move 37. And basically the move that was played is a move that like no Go player would ever play because it looks stupid. It looks like you don't know what you're doing. It's like no one plays that move. And what's amazing is that when AlphaGo played that move on the board, all of the moves, every single move that had been done before that move, played in unison. It was basically like a team move where all of those moves were networked, and then the game was won in that moment, in that move 37, the move no human would make. And what was kind of incredible about that, as Lisa Dole literally said, before this, I really thought that this was just a box of math and a computational algorithm and a predictive system. But with this move, it's insightful, it's beautiful, and it's creative. This is something else. And so I think what is possible, and again, it's such early days and this is such a small thing, but it shows me a sign of life for, again, like this empathic path or the sense of connection or understanding or transparency that we can have that's like a whole new meaning for what intuitive and what feels good and doesn't feel like a struggle with technology. Because what happened here is not empathy. But it is an empathic leap, because if what empathy is to look with someone else's eyes at something, is to understand through their eyes what an experience is, and to know that because of your own, then the empathic leap is to be able to try on another point of view, another perspective, another kind of perception of what is going on, and see a new way for yourself. And I think that's what happened with Lee in this moment. He literally, what you had was two Go players. One was a machine, one was a human. They're both at the foot of this kind of ancient game. And what does it mean to be able to see a new way to play a game because of the machine? It's like, that's kind of this empathic leap that I think is really fascinating for us to explore. And that's actually, like, I could talk about this really quickly. Yeah, I'll do this really quickly. How many of you guys have heard of Joseph Beuys, the artist? Awesome. Yeah, right on. So what's rad about Joseph Beuys, and what I'll say for kind of some of the incredibly brilliant people that I work with, is they often talk about how the promise of this space is the augmentation, the enhancement, what can be possible for us, like glasses or anything else that helps us correct or do more than we could do. And I think they talk about that as this kind of like, oh, it's not necessarily about kind of superpowers in a sense where you feel like there's this other thing that's all powerful. It's actually about what you add, enhance in yourself. And they talk about that as being the Iron Man suit, which I think is brilliant, because it's a way of looking at how do you let like a person be kind of the master of their data and their destiny and just be capable of more. And my kind of, again, IQ to EQ match there is, if we're designing the Iron Man suit, so to speak, metaphorically, what about the felt suit? And what's beautiful about what Beuys as a post-war artist did was he designed this felt suit because he felt that it was both protective and nurturing and nourishing at the same time. It was literally because walking around on Earth is just like a really hard, messy experience for humans. And he knew that really well as someone who had to leave Europe after the war. And so with this suit, which literally like will hang in museums and usually is by an air conditioning vent and will kind of flutter in this really delicate way, it's just a reminder of, for every incredible thing that we create, this new capacity, this new kind of superpower, how do we make sure that we're building it in a way that's really nourishing and protecting, meeting people where they are, and kind of showing up in a way that connects with them, that designs for that kind of other layer. And I think something that I don't really have a slide for, but I'll just say, because I feel like what's interesting is when Kai and I first talked about this talk, it was something I was excited to kind of share with the design community. But I think we're in a different place now, even as just a couple of weeks ago. What it means to design right now, it's not just about a new wave of technology that's assistance in AI and all this stuff you can kind of have in your toolkit to design for it. I think right now the conversation we're having around AI and design, or the way I take it on in terms of design, is this is about deep humanity. This is about human rights. This is about ethics. This is about human potential. And I think to figure out how you feel about all of those things means that what needs to show up in you and in your work, the things that we normally would say, this is a personal conversation, this is an HR conversation. I show up to be perfect. I show up to nail stuff. I show up to like solve that problem. I don't let all the messy human stuff come in, because like, basically we're praised and we are rewarded for engineering the vulnerability out of things. And really, for this space and for the space we're in culturally and together, it requires that we actually let it in rather than engineering it out. So I think what's kind of lovely is that Brene Brown, actually, I brought her to Google a couple of weeks ago to talk to us about this and to do a workshop. And she said this incredible thing, which was something that we, again, epiphanies are profound and obvious. She said, design is a function of empathy. And I actually think right now in this space, being designers in it, it's design as a function of empathy. It also can be an act of courage. And I think being able to go there yourself and into the work and ask all the hard questions and have the hard conversations, I see it changing things for my team. I invite you to do it for yours. Thank you.